Is SQL Developer Data Modeler just what you need? Our presenter is David Schleiss, and David has 20 years of experience with Oracle database and development products, has 15 years of experience creating web-based applications and services, and he's built numerous systems on many different platforms for a variety of business customers, and more recently has focused on the higher education vertical. So without further ado, let's begin. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. So, welcome everybody to SQL Developer Data Modeler, just what you need. I'd like to thank you all for being here. And as Mark said, I've been doing this for quite a while, but mostly what that means is that I've had a chance to make more mistakes than a lot of my coworkers, and I welcome any opportunity to help them out so they don't make the same ones. As you can see, I have a Twitter handle, a blog, and you can always reach me by email. So for the next hour, I'm going to be talking about SQL Developer Data Modeler and what I think are some of its strengths and weaknesses. And to do this, I'm going to go through what I'm referring to as a frozen demo, so you don't have to tolerate my horrendous typing skills. This presentation is targeted toward a casual or curious beginning user, but hopefully even experienced users might find something new. So before we get too far into this, I'd like to let you know that there are in fact two flavors of Data Modeler. There's the standalone version and also an embedded version that lives within SQL Developer. I will get those two confused throughout the course of this presentation, so please bear with me and I will try to correct it when I say the wrong thing. So when you're using the embedded version, everything I'm doing here, you can do there. There's just another layer of menus that you'll have to go through. So one of the great strengths of Data Modeler is that it allows us to document and enhance our projects using several different types of models. And I should also note here that, as Mark said, these were presentations from Kscope 18, which was held at Walt Disney World. So you might find some additional Disney-like references throughout the course of this presentation. The first of these models is the logical model or conceptual model, and it's primarily a tool that you would use to communicate with the business users, your subject matter experts. This is also referred to as an entity relationship or ER diagrams. And what the logical model does is it identifies things that matter to the business that are part of the system that you will be developing. It also captures important stuff about those things. These are the attributes for those entities. And it also captures how these things are related to other entities. And this helps describe the entities themselves and how they interact. An important thing to remember is that logical models are in no way dependent on how the solution is going to be implemented. SQL Developer Data Modeler also lets us capture relational models. And the relational model represents how a system is going to be implemented within a relational database. The entities roughly correspond to tables, the attributes to the table columns, and the relationships to the foreign keys found between those tables. The relational model is not dependent on any particular brand or version of relational database. Now, the physical model describes how the relational model will be implemented within a specific database platform, Oracle 12, SQL Server, etc. Data Modeler also allows you to document process models, but we will not be covering those today. What we will be covering is how Data Modeler has an array of features that are designed to support the entire systems development lifecycle. It's a tool to help with the documentation and communication of system requirements, a tool to assist you with documenting and designing and building the system. and it's a tool to make the ongoing management and enhancement of systems more manageable. So say you're an analyst and you want to document a system from the ground up. You start with a logical model. You can then create a relational model from that, and from there, generate the DDL to build a physical model. If you're a developer and you just want a visual representation of the system you're designing and building, the relational modeler gives you an efficient way of communicating this information. And then you can, again, generate the DDL for a database, and if you wish, create a logical model from that model as well. And when you're doing maintenance or enhancements on a project that already exists where a database is already instantiated, you can start with by importing an existing model, and then from that, creating a relational model, and if you wish, taking it all the way to the logical model. So here it is. Here's SQL Developer. This is what it looks like when you first open it after it is freshly installed. This is for version 18.1. All of the demos I have today are using version 18.1. 18.2 was released last week or the week before, quite recently. So I encourage you all to download and use that version. So this is how it used to go. I'd come back from a conference having seen a demo of the latest version of Data Modeler, and I'd be convinced that, okay, this is how I'm going to have to do my next project. I'm going to use Data Modeler. But when it came time to start that project, I would open up the tool and I would immediately be frustrated that I couldn't make the work the way I saw it work in the demo. And I'd eventually just give up and go back to the way I always did things. So in practice, it went something like this. I open up Data Modeler. I want to create a logical model, but how do I do that? Looking under File, there's no new or create, nothing there. There's no new here either, or here, or here, or here. Now I'm just getting desperate. So we get to Help. And okay, let's look for Create Entity, nothing there. Create Logical, nothing there. Double click on Logical, nothing that really is going to help us here to create a new logical model. So I would go and I'd start drawing on paper once again. I don't know why I expected to be able to just come into this tool and start using it without taking time to really learn it. Probably because the demos just made it look so easy. I knew how to use Oracle Designer, so I should be able to use this, right? But then again, I attended 2 weeks of instructor-led training to learn Designer, so that might have something to do with it. Some people complain about tools like Microsoft Word that give you 87 different ways to do one thing. But I think that's an effective means of making a complex product seem intuitive. By providing multiple ways of performing a task, one of these ways is likely to be the preferred mechanism of the user, thereby making the product feel intuitive. But that's not how Data Modeler works. For many operations, there's a single means of performing a task. And if you don't know that one way to get something done, it's just not going to get done. If you're serious about learning this tool, this book is for you. It's the Data Modeler for Database Design Mastery by Heli. I'm not going to butcher her last name. She just goes by Heli from Finland. The Data Modeler Forum is also a great place to look for answers. And remember, if you're going to ask a question, first see if it's been asked before. It's very helpful because a lot of people have the same questions that you're going to run into. So what I failed to realize is that when you open up the modeler, you're already in a design. There's already a logical model there and waiting for you. You just can't see it. So how do you unlock the mystery of Data Modeler? Well, it's the magic of the right click. Context menus are very important. in Data Modeler. Okay, so here we have a logical model. It's open, I can see it. Now what? So here's the next opportunity for some frustration. I click on entity, nothing. I double click on entity, still nothing. Right click, still nothing. So, but up here on the top, we have some new icons to work with. And this is the one that we're going to be interested in, new entity. So I click on new entity and still nothing. But if you click within the logical model diagram window, you get the entity properties box. Finally, something's happening. So I put in a new name for my entity and look at some of the other properties that are listed here. I like to use surrogate keys, so I'm going to use that. Now to add some attributes, we click on the attributes, click on the big green plus, and start adding attributes. So I want a name for the beer that I'm going to be putting in here. I forgot to mention, I apologize. So this demo is going to be showing a simple way of scoring beers, kind of like if any of you are familiar with an Untapped application. So drinking a beer, you say, oh, this one's pretty good, this one's not. I want to keep record of this. So I'm creating a database to do that because Untapped is just not good enough for me. So we give the entity a name, and now we're giving the attributes the name. So the beer is going to have a name. And I want to make this a varchar. So I look here, and the source type, all I get listed is unknown. This is not helping me. Again, what's going on here? So I remember from my designer days that you could create domain objects that are used to have consistent naming properties throughout an entire project. So for something such as name, you can say that a name has 40 characters long and it's going to be required. And then you can use this domain in all of your entities for consistency and ease. But I don't want to take time for setting up domains right now. So I do the next logical thing and click on logical. And that's what I needed to do. And under here, I find some more familiar data types. So, but even with that, varchar is listed as just that. There's no 2 on the end. What's going on here? So again, if you recall, I said that a logical model is implementation independent. This doesn't have to turn into a database, so I could just as easily say string here in order to indicate that this is going to be some sort of character-based data type. So I give it a size, I make it mandatory, I add a lovely comment, add another attribute. So this is going to be a numeric rating. And I want to be able to give it from 1 to 5 stars because that should be sufficient. So I double click on the rating and lo and behold, it's an intuitive product. It does what I expected it to do. It opened up the attribute properties, which is great. First of all, I'm kind of stunned that there are so many properties here that I can deal with, but I'm here to set values, allowed values. So I click on this default and constraint area, which opens up the default and constraint dialog box. I can give my constraint a name and a default value of 1 because, well, it is beer after all. And then I click on the giant button labeled none to set the constraint text or rule. I'm not sure which database or if I'm even going to be putting this in a database. So my code is going to go under generic. I enter the constraint information. I also want to make sure that to provide a list of allowable values. So I click on the values button and I start adding my value. After adding all of my values, I can click on OK. And here we have our constraints. Close that, and lo and behold, there it is, my logical model. So at this point, it has been so hard to get here that I don't want to lose what I've got. So I want to save File, Save As, and you can just save it on your file system. It's saved as a series of XML files in directories. At this point, I would like to tell you that Data Modeler has Subversion integration. And this integration allows you to have very fine-grained control about what's been changed within your model and who has changed it. It does all of the great things that Subversion should do for you. Now, the menu is grayed out here because I personally I have not installed the Subversion tools. This doesn't mean I'm not using Subversion, just not this integrated tool set. So the reason I'm not using the integrated Subversion is twofold, really. First of all but one of the projects that I've worked on so far I'm the only one using Data Modeler. So I find it easier simply to add the Data Modeler directory to the SVN repository and just save my model there. The other reason is that the one project where I didn't work alone, we used two different methods. I was using the integrated method of keeping Subversion, of using Subversion, and the other analyst was using the direct method that I described earlier of just including the Data Modeler files within a Subversion repository. So you really need to decide which method you're going to use, because not doing so can lead to some unexpected consequences, and they're really not the good kind. So I go on and I add a style and a brewery to my model. And now, before I get to that, one thing I did want to mention is that the new entity function is sticky. So once you click on new entity, you are in make new entity mode, and that anytime you click within the logical model designer window, the new entity window is going to pop up. Now, this is a feature, but this feature really annoys me. Now we need to put relationships between our entities, and we can choose from different types of relationships. We have a many-to-many relationship, a one-to-many relationship, one-to-many with an identifying, meaning that the relationship is part of a unique key for the entity, and one-to-one relationships. So because I'm using a one-to-many relationship, I start in the one entity and drag over to the many, and the relation properties dialog opens. Again, I want to use a surrogate key, so I check that. And since the logical model is a communication tool designed to help the business understand, to prove to the business that we understand their business, we can put on these action verbs to help describe the relationship. So in this case, we say that a brewery can brew beer and that a beer is brewed by a brewery. You can also check on the cardinality to make sure that we drew the arrow in the right direction. And here we see that a beer can have a brewery can have many beers, and a beer can only belong to one brewery. Optionality, a brewery can exist without any beers, but a beer cannot exist without a brewery. And then there's the transferable property, which is, well, what is it actually? So if you click on F1, you get help, but unfortunately, sometimes the help isn't all that helpful. So digging further, we find that transferable is also defined within foreign key properties. So if we look here, we see basically, as it says, an employee can be transferred later from one department to another. So the parent could change. And since that's possible, we'll check that as well. Here you can also define what's going to happen to a beer if a brewery is deleted. Sad but true, it happens. So we look back to our model, and where are the labels that we just put in here? Again, they're hiding. If we right-click on the model, and we can choose show labels, and once we do that, there are the labels that we put in. So here we can read this relationship sentence saying that a brewery can brew one or more beers, and a beer must be brewed by one and only one brewery. Excellent. For the style, I'm going to say that a beer can have multiple styles. So we get a many-to-many relationship here. And every entity should have a unique identifier, not the surrogate key I was talking about, but something within its own definition that uniquely defines it. So we should also set up unique identifiers for all of our entities. By double clicking on the entity and then unique identifier and the big green plus again, and then on the key name, we're able to put in the name of our unique identifier, and under attributes and relations, we use this shuttle control to identify which of these attributes and relationships will uniquely identify this entity. I should also point out right now that within the entity properties, this is for the data modeling geeks out there, this is where you would define the support for supertype and subtype relationships, as well as ARC relationships. So if this doesn't mean anything to you, that's all right. If it does, you can identify here just how these constructs are going to be translated to the relational model on an individual case-by-case basis. So this gives you a lot of control over using those more sophisticated types. So once all my entities have unique identifiers, I'm going to call this model complete. And if this is a real business situation, I'm going to confirm with the business that we understand what they do and how they do it based on this model. So we show them this and they look at it and says, that's beautiful. Well, what does it mean? So then you say, well, it's pretty simple, really. All you have to do is look here, and then you explain to them about the dotted lines versus the solid lines, and which direction you read it, and the crow's feet and the not crow's feet, and then they say, that's awesome. We'll get back to you on that. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and in many cases that's true, but in this case, the words would be much more useful to the business than this picture. And since the logical model is supposed to be a communication mechanism, our model is failing here. Back in the olden days, I used a tool called Oracle Designer. It was perfect. That's a lie. But it also allowed you to create logical models. And it had as one of its reports these relationship sentences. So you could click a button and the relationship sentences would spit out. So you could give that to the business rather than the pictures. Now, don't get me wrong, Data Modeler has an extremely robust reporting mechanism. And in fact, it's worth a presentation on its own. But I do not know of an existing report that produces these relationship sentences. So one of the most powerful features of Data Modeler is the ability to modify your models using scripts rather than the GUI interface. And this is called transformation scripting. However, in addition to transforming your models, these scripts can also be used to report on information contained within your models. When you open the transformation script dialog, you're most likely going to get a warning message, and this is basically telling you that you do not have JRuby installed. And you will get this message every time you open up the custom transformation script dialog, unless you either install JRuby or eliminate the offending scripts. I chose to eliminate the offending scripts. You can click on them and click the big red X, and then they're gone. So last year, I gave an entire presentation on the scripting capabilities within Data Modeler. And if you're at all interested, you can check it out on InSum's website. Within that presentation, I explained that the demonstration scripts provided with Data Modeler are written in Oracle Nashorn JavaScript, but you can also add the groovy language to write your scripts. And I also introduced a set of helper scripts called SDDM Plus to make writing scripts within Data Modeler much easy. This scripting library is available at Aura Open Source if you're interested. So with just a few lines of code, and it's in the examples directory on GitHub that I just showed you, you can create a report like this one. Again, it's not much to look at with a small model like this, but having a report like this for a business to look over can be a pretty valuable tool. If you really don't want to learn about transformation scripting, you can export your entire design to a reporting schema where you can use good old SQL to slice and dice the data, the design information. Note that this is a one-way transfer, and the reporting schema is just that. You can't make changes in that reporting schema and then push them back into your designer models. So that's it for the logical modeling. Are there any questions? Mark, were there any?
We have 2 questions, which I don't see right now. I'm just gonna check. Okay, all right. So they're basically sound questions on sound quality. We've been trying to test the sound quality here. It looks okay at our end, so we'll continue looking into that. Hopefully everyone has a relatively good sound question. So outside that, no other questions.
Very good. Then, carrying on. Now that we have a solid logical model, we're going to turn this into a relational model. So again, we right-click on logical model and choose engineer to relational model. Here we're allowed to choose which elements of the logical model we want to push to the relational. You also have a chance to decide which relational model you want to push your logical model to. So if you're going to have multiple relational models, you must create the relational model first before you can use this feature. There has to be an empty relational model for you to generate to. The engineer to relational model window also has a tabular view as opposed to the tree view. This basically just automatically unfolds all of the tree. It opens all of the nodes on the tree. So anything
David,
that you, yes.
sorry to interrupt. We do have a question. Could I give it to you right now?
Sure, there goes my flow, but whatever.
So sorry. The question is, what is the best way to share a model between colleagues since there is no repository like in Designer?
Again, that goes back to the comments about subversion. If you are both going to be working simultaneously on a model, you really need to investigate the SVN capabilities built in to Data Modeler. That's how so using SVN is the short answer to that. If you've created a model and you want it to send it to someone so they have their own copy of it, when you save your design, you save it to the file system. It's a directory. You save it in a directory, you just give them that directory and they have the design. So I think this leads more to the first the first situation though, where if you're going to be collaborating on a design, you're going to want to investigate the SVN capabilities built in to Data Modeler. Okay.
Thanks, David.
You're welcome. So back to the tabular view. Here we can select or deselect those items that we want to push from the logical model into the relational model. If you click on an item, the details are shown below. So you can see that we have constraints, we have data types, a lot of information. If you click on engineer, it creates the logical model. There it is for you. It's beautiful, but not beautiful enough. Some things about this I really don't like. First of all, I don't want mixed case in my table names. I want everything to be uppercase. So that's one issue. The foreign key names are totally redundant. It's got the table name and the column name, but since I named things with, but since it also names things with the table, the primary key with the table name, it's extremely redundant. And also I want to list my keys, my identifiers at the top of the table, not at the bottom. So I can open up the beer table by double clicking on it. And then I look at the unique constraint that I had created, and I really do not like the name of that either. So let's take a look at some properties to see if we could have the engineer to relational do something more like, well, like I like rather than it likes. So there's certainly no shortage of preferences and properties within Data Modeler. You can find them at the global level, at the design level, and at the model level. Looking at the model level, we can see here that we can rename our relational model and also choose a database, a default database to generate to. Here under naming options, we can see that here is where I can tell it I want everything to be uppercase. So I set uppercase on for table and column, etc. Under design properties, naming standards looks interesting. And here we see that within the logical model, any spaces are going to be replaced with underscores. Also, templates looks interesting. So we dig into that. And here we see how the foreign key names are created. It has the reference table and the reference column. Well, again, since the reference column already has the table name in it, I don't need that. That's shown here, that the table name, the table abbreviation, is going to be included in the name of the surrogate key. So I can modify the foreign key column name just to be the column found in the other table. Again, like I said, I didn't like how it named the unique constraint. So if I click on Add Variable, not a greatly named button, it shows you other items you can use in this template to name your unique key. And I think I want to add a sequence number to it. So we click on OK, and then I finish editing that. So it's going to be, the unique constraint is going to be named table _UN and then a sequence number. We then engineer it to relational and it looks better, but the IDs, we have the uppercase, but the IDs are still not in uppercase. So I select everything and delete it, re-engineer, and look, we have uppercase names, which is what we were going for. But I like the names to be the keys. Like I said, I like the keys to be at the top. So within the custom transformation scripts, there's an existing script that does exactly what we need it to do. It's called column order, and it reorders the columns. So you want to run that. But first, I must stress, there is no rollback within Data Modeler. There is no way to undo what you're going to do with this transformation script. So before you run it, make sure you save it and then save your design, and then you can run the transformation. And when we do that, we see that we did in fact move the IDs to the top, which is what we were going for. So I like to put audit columns in all of my tables. So how do we handle that? So the fact that I said all of these tables should clue you in that the solution to this is going to be scripting. And that's how we're going to do it. And in fact, again, the demonstration scripts that are included with Data Modeler gives you a script to do exactly that. Add columns to all tables within your model. So what these comments tell us is that we need to create a table called table template. So within the diagrammer, I click on New Table, Create Table Template, add the columns that I want to add to every table. And when I save this, it complains that the table template name isn't, that the name of the table is not in uppercase. This was because I had told it earlier that I want table names in uppercase. So it's just giving me a warning. So again, we're going to save the model. We're going to save our design, and then we'll apply this. And once we do, we see that the audit columns have been added to all the tables. But won't these columns need triggers? Well, yes, they will. And again, since all the tables need triggers, we're again going to want to use scripting. But this time it's not transformation scripting, but table DDL transformation scripting. What this does is allows you to completely control the DDL generated from your relational model to the point of allowing you to support databases that are not recognized by Data Modeler out of the box. You can inject SQL commands at specific points within the processing of your model. Further discussion of this is outside the scope of this talk. So if you want to learn more, please, again, see my presentation from last year. So we're ready to generate the DDL, just about. But before we do, we should go into modeler preferences and look at what the modeler is going to do about DDL. Because I'm creating a very simple database and I'm not a DBA, I'm not going to include these details in my DDL. Also, under DDL storage, I'm not comfortable setting these storage limits either. So I am going to uncheck all of these. You should, of course, consult your DBA. In the design properties, I'm able to tell the generator to create primary keys, and I'm indexes for primary keys, unique keys, and foreign keys. So I'm going to say, yes, I want the generator to create these indexes. And I'm just about to click the button to generate DDL, and I realize that style is a reserved word in Oracle. So the easy thing to do would be to generate the DDL and just change the name of the table to something else. But then all the models I've created, I cannot regenerate this DDL. So ultimately, that makes my models much less useful. So it's less easy, but the right thing to do to modify the models. If we look in the entity properties, we see that the preferred abbreviation, if you put a value here, that's going to be used to generate the table name. So putting something there other than a reserved word, such as styles, allows us to subvert that. And here we see that because the name property is in red below, that Data Modeler knows that something has changed once we're engineering to relational. And sure enough, once we get there, we see that it says styles instead of style, so we're ready to generate DDL. This was the next breakpoint. Mark, anything?
Yes, indeed. Forgot to mention that the previous question was from Mohammed Zabib, and we have a question from Eric Schroth. I hope I have pronounced that correctly. And the question is, why wouldn't you put the audit column requirement in the logical model?
So typically, the audit columns are important for the database. There's not, in the business, those items don't exist. So an employee does not have a date created, it has a birthday. So the audit columns are strictly for record keeping within the database. As I said, the logical model is designed to communicate with the business. So you don't put things that are solely part of database bookkeeping within the logical model, because the logical model should be clean and not hold items that are only important to the database. You'll also notice that there was no ID column in the logical model, because there again, that surrogate ID column is strictly for database bookkeeping and does not belong in the logical model. If you want to discuss this further as a philosophical point, please give me a buzz.
All right. And we have another question from Bozo Stojanovic. How do you audit changed data, not just time and person?
Okay, so within Data Modeler, this is actually a good question, because of the capabilities of Data Modeler within the DDL transformation scripting, there is one example script, and that example script has complete journaling, which is what you're talking about. So if you look into so tools, transformation scripting, and then it's the DDL transformation scripts, the one example script that they have in there does exactly what you're looking for. And I think I really need to get moving, sorry.
That's okay, no further questions so far.
All right. So at this point, we're ready to generate some DDL. It's about time, I know you're thinking. So to do that, we simply file, export to DDL. And we open this up and it's like, whoa, wait a minute, where's the DDL? But before we see any DDL, we have to generate it. And we haven't clicked the button yet to give it permission. Note here that you can also change the database you're generating the DDL for, as well as which of your relational models you're generating for. So once we click on generate, again, we get we're presented with a tree view of the items, the objects that are going to be generated. This also has a blown out view basically. And here it's easy to pick what tables we do not want to have DDL generated for. Table template, because that again was simply there to help us put in those audit columns. We would uncheck that. Then we click on the generate button and lo and behold, there we have it. All this beautiful DDL. So we take that beautiful DDL and we put it into our favorite database tool and run it, and there we go, we have our database. So now we just took it from the model and we put it in the database, and without touching anything else, I want to see how the database version compares with the model version. So to do this, you would click on the Synchronize Model button, and once we do that, it asks, well, how are you going to get a connection? You have, in order to compare to this database, you need to have a connection. So if you're using the embedded version of Data Modeler, you're set, because all of the connections that you have defined there are also in Data Modeler. But if you are using the standalone version, well, you can't do that. So how do we create this? Instead of going through a simulated frustration, I'm just going to tell you that this is another thing you just have to know. In order to create a connection, you have to pretend that you're importing a data dictionary. This is the only way I know of to get the connection the database connection dialog. And once you do, you can add a new connection. If you're at all familiar with SQL Developer, this should look familiar. So we've created a connection. These database synchronization options, again, the best way to find out what they do is to try them. Because when you click the button, nothing happens until you tell it to change something. So doing this step, using it, selecting several of these options is completely harmless. So this time when I do it, it tells me that that something's really wrong. It wants me to drop all the tables in my model and replace them with new versions. And if we look closely, we can see that it's because the schema is attached on the database and not in the model. So what you want to do now is look again in the properties. And here you can see that we can use properties such as even case-sensitive names in compare functionality. So if the case is different between the model and the database, it's going to say that it's different and should be replaced. So I'm going to uncheck all those, do the synchronization again, and again it tells me that the schema is different, but it doesn't say I need to drop my tables in order to, because of it. If we look further and we look at the beer, the identifier column, we see that in the database, or the identity column, in the database, it's set to false. It's not using identity. But in the model, I said use identity. So what's going on here? Why is it doing this? Well, if we check the properties, it's not surprising, but Data Modeler is doing just what we told it to do. It says use a trigger, not to use the identity clause. So if we switch that, we can regenerate. After we switch that, we can right-click on the beer table and do a DDL preview. And there we see that now when we generate the DDL, we're going to get the identity columns. We can also see that in the database, the indexes that we asked Modeler to create exist, but they don't exist in our model still because it was a function of the DDL generator that created them. So at this point, I start using this wonderful database and I realize that I'm missing something. There's so many great breweries in Madison. I want to be able to put in an address to see where a place is. So not thinking, I directly modify my database. And by doing so, I add an address column. And later I come to realize that, well, that was really ridiculous. Why did I change my database? I should have changed the model. So now I'm going to synchronize what's in the database with the with my model. So here the trick is to pretty much uncheck everything except the one thing, the things that you know you want to bring over. So by selecting only address, I am going to only push addresses into my model, or the address into my model. We click on the merge button, and then we open up the table in our relational model. We can see that address now exists there, so I can change where it is in the list of columns. And now I want to take it from here and I want to push it into the logical model. So again, you're given this tree view. You can select exactly the things that you want to turn into your logical model, bring into your logical model. And one thing to note, again, maybe it's a feature, maybe it's a bug, I'm not sure. But if you don't uncheck the name of the table, it will overwrite the name in the entity in uppercase. Well, whatever the table name is, it's going to overwrite the entity name with that. I'm not sure why. Additionally, every single column within that table, if you do not uncheck the name property, is going to have the attribute name renamed, in this case, to an uppercase version. So again, feature, bug, I'm not sure, but that's what it does. Okay, again, we're going to engineer to the logical model. And there it is. We have our logical models are now, our logical and relational models are now in sync with the database. So after using my database for a while more, I realized that there's a flaw in my model. Some beers, they may change formula or my tastes change. So my opinion of a beer is really not a property of the beer, but of a tasting. So it should be a table, the rating, it should be a table of its own, not simply a property. So this time I'm going to do it right. I create a rating table. I copy the rating attribute from my beer entity, and I can paste it directly into my new rating entity. And what's nice is that all of the properties of that attribute come along with it, so I still have my list of values. I add a tasting date and a relationship. You'll notice I eliminate rating from the beer table, and now I'm going to engineer that to the relational. Again, uncheck those items that you know should not change, and keep only the ones that should. You have to specifically say delete this on the left-hand side in order to get rid of the column. And here we're adding this new table and the foreign key. So we generate, or we have the new table within our relational model, but we need to change the order and also add our audit columns. Again, if save, we can rerun both of those scripts. It will not affect any of the other tables, only the new table because of the way those scripts are written. And we now have a new table in our model, set up the way we like it. Well, okay, the way I like it. You can also add table level constraints directly to your relational model. Here I'm adding a requirement that the tasting date has to have started this year, because I had no class at all before the beginning of this year as far as beer is concerned. So anything I tasted before that just doesn't count. So this time I'm going to synchronize my model with the data dictionary. So I'm going to look for the DDL that it's going to take to change the data dictionary to match what's in my model. So when I do that, I see that I'm going to drop the rating. And again, in order to get this to work, I have to explicitly check the to drop on the left-hand side. And again, uncheck everything that I don't want involved in this transaction. Here you see the new table level constraint that we also provided or created. And when we generate the DDL, you see it's going to drop the column, and also below you see the table constraint that we've defined. Again, you're not going to want to drop the column before you migrate the data probably, but here's the DDL to do it all. Again, since we just ran the DDL, we're going to compare what happened in the database with what's in our model. And when we synchronize back, I want to show you that some might call this, again, some are going to call this a feature, some might call it a bug. I would be one of those, but it's just something you need to be aware of. When you're synchronizing the data dictionary to a model, table level constraints are converted to column constraints. So just if you notice this, it's expected behavior. Whether it's correct in your eyes or not is up to you. So I'm going to forego the questions because of time constraints and kind of race through the rest of this. I apologize. So that was a greenfield application, taking something from a model and turning it into a database. In real life, that doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, we take something and have to convert it into something else. So we add enhancements or new features. Data Modeler works for this too. We can import, as I showed you earlier, from a data dictionary. There are multiple sources that you can use, but in this case, we're going to go through a data dictionary. You have your connection. You can select the tables that you're going to import. Click on the next button. These gears will turn for a length of time depending on the number of objects you selected. You get a report of it's imported, and here is your relational model. Many times your project will have to deal with a subset of the items, and many times the subset of items, subset of tables are related. So Data Modeler helps you by allowing you to click on a table and select neighbors. And you can, using this feature, you can select the directions that it's going to follow to get these neighbors, and also how many layers deep it's going to go. Another handy feature is the ability to create a subview, because your project might not be dealing with every single table in the design, just a subset of them. So you can create that subview. It allows you to change the layouts easily. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a better layout. So remember, again, always save before you do these things. You can delete items from your subview by clicking delete views. If you click delete objects, they're gone from the model completely. You can change color of your objects in your relational or logical models by clicking on format. And this is an important one. You need to uncheck use default format, so we can create different colors. Here we see, if you look at your entire model or your entire relational model again, your universe is now in a different color. So this helps you visualize project impact and scope. We can then engineer this relational model to a logical model. Again, you're given all of the items and you get to select which ones you want to use. And here again, this goes back to some of philosophy more than anything. If you're going to share this with the customer, the EBA cust in the name of this table might have to do, probably has more to do with your application and database than with their business. So using a simple script, we can remove these prefixes from all of the entities. You would, of course, save before you run that, but there it does, it cleans it all up. So how do you make SQL Developer Data Modeler just what you need? When in doubt, try a right click. This isn't a really intuitive tool, at least in my opinion, and you just have to work with what it has. And like other tools, save early, save often, especially before running any sort of transformations. The tool is only going to do what you tell it to. There are a plethora of preferences and properties that you need to check into and respect. And if it's doing something that you're not expecting, it's probably because of a preference or property. When synchronizing, importing, or exporting, remember, you have granular control over what items are included. Use it. And the scripting capabilities are just too useful and too powerful not to take advantage of. So please do, and if you'd be so kind, check out my webinar from last year. I would like to give some, I may have borrowed a few images that you might have noticed throughout the course of the presentation. I'd like to give a little credit to those. Thank you, Internet, for supplying them. And thank you all for spending some of your valuable time with me. At this point, are there any more questions now that we're 2 minutes over?
Thank you so much, David. Yes, there are a few questions, and we'll start by answering them right away. First question from Mohammed Zabib, again, is how can export your SQL Data Modeler preferences set up when migrating from one version to another?
Preferences. So the majority of your preferences should be saved when you install a new version of Data Modeler. It asks you if you want to import the preferences from a previous version of Data Modeler. If your question goes beyond that, please write down my email address right now and I will answer you directly.
Okay. And we had another question from Mohammed, which is how to add a database update insert trigger template code to all tables having audit columns.
Okay, there again, that's going to be in the transformation, the DDL transformation scripting. And for details on that, I would again point people towards my webinar from last year. And if you have more specific questions, again, let me know. I enjoy this, working with this product, especially the scripting aspect of it. So if you have additional questions, email me, please.
Okay. And we have another question from Bozo Stojanovic, sorry. Is it possible to change column order in database like it is possible in model?
That is going to depend on your database. So yeah, that's the only way I can answer that question. Sorry.
Okay. We have a question from Saeed Hassanpour, and who asks, could you generate a journal table?
Yes, again, that was what I mentioned earlier under transformations, DDL transformation scripts. The one example script that is provided with Data Modeler has the creation of a journal table. So, and it creates all the triggers, everything you need. Check it out. It's pretty cool. So if you're familiar with Designer, Oracle Designer had journaling tables, and this is a very similar capability, and all you need to do is push a button.
Okay. I believe that was the last of the questions.
Very
And
good.
so, yep, I think we're done. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And if you do have questions, please contact David. And also, a recording will be made available of this session within, and we'll email you about that. And please look forward to the next sessions that we'll have coming up in July and August. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you again.